Section 2 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 1. The School of Miletus, Part 2. 3. The Seven Sages. In an early stage of civilization, people are saved the trouble of thinking about moral philosophy or abstract principles of right conduct by learning the laws and customs of their land or tribe, just as mythology saves them the trouble of finding scientific explanations of natural processes. But where a number of petty states exist side by side, each with laws of its own, where repeated changes of government involve the necessity of making new laws, above all, where the individual members of the community have so far emancipated themselves from the yoke of custom as to exercise a certain discretion in the management of their private affairs, there a sort of moral rationalism will arise, an idea that certain things should be done because they are good in themselves, not because they are prescribed by authority. These conditions were fulfilled to a remarkable extent in the Hellenic world during the first half of the 6th century B.C. The old patriarchal monarchies, such as we find still existing in Homer's time, had given place to aristocratic republics, and in many instances one of the aristocrats had succeeded for a time in making himself what the Greeks called a tyrant or absolute ruler, by playing off the people against the nobles. Men who formerly occupied a leading position in their own city were driven into exile, and spent their enforced leisure in visiting foreign parts and studying the varieties of human life there offered to their observation. A vast extension of commerce brought the Greek mind into the vivifying contact with the great Oriental civilizations, and with the uncivilized inhabitants of northern Europe. Moreover, the economical revolution brought with it unexpected changes of fortune and new valuations of personal worth. It came to be a popular saying that money makes the man, long descent counting for little or nothing when the hereditary magnate had lost his paternal estates. It was in these circumstances that a group of worthies became widely celebrated under the name of the Seven Sages of Greece. Each sage got the credit of having originated some pithy saying which thenceforward became a current coin in the treasure of popular wisdom. What strikes us most about these adages is their brevity and the abstract wording that distinguishes them from the proverbs of other nations. Some of them had the glory of being inscribed on the walls of the temple at Delphi, and two in particular are pregnant with a wisdom that the highest Greek ethical teaching did but expand and apply. These are, "Be moderate and know thyself." To realize and practice the duties they recommend was to possess in its fullness what was par excellence the Greek virtue of sophrosyney. We ordinarily render the word by temperance, but temperance, even in the wide sense of avoiding excess in every direction, fails to convey its full meaning. For he to whom nature or training has given sophrosyney adds the faculty of self-knowledge to the faculty of self-control. He is what artists call the master of his means. He has learned what he can do, and does it. Something tells him how far he can go. Up to that point he goes, but not a step beyond. Opposed to sophrosyney as the ideal Greek virtue was what one may call the ideal Greek vice, in the sense of what wise Greeks most abhorred, that is, hubris. Literally, hubris means no more than excess, and some trace of this significance survives in our word hybrid, used primarily of animals that are a cross between two species, thus, as it were, exceeding the limits assigned to them by nature. Morally and etymologically, hubris is also connected with the word outrage, which literally means no more than going beyond. that is, beyond what reason and law prescribe, but which in the evolution of language has come to mean going beyond the bounds of ordinary license and crime. The Greeks, as a dignified and self-respecting people, were peculiarly sensitive to all such transgressions, from insolent and overbearing language to acts of unprovoked and gross personal violence committed in the mere wantonness of irresistible power. Nature, as they conceived her, is bound by strict laws of limitation, and therefore the gods, being nature powers, showed themselves particularly hostile to hubris, and the poetic interpretations of mythology all went to show that the old kingly races had perished by drawing down divine vengeance on their parricidal crimes or on their incestuous loves. In historic times the same feeling was particularly directed against the outrageous abuses of power committed by tyrants on the one side and by unbridled democracies on the other. As a mean between these two extremes, aristocracy found most favour with thinking men, while if a democracy had become firmly established, they looked to the middle class as the best guardian of social order against the turbulence of the nobles or of the people. 4. The reign of law. I have said that the Greeks conceived nature as bound by a law of limitation. This conception is so closely connected with their habits of political self-government, with the fact that their cities were constituted as free republics, each jealously guarding its independence against all the others, that we cannot tell which came first, the political organization or the creed. At any rate, that their republican habits led to the philosophical idea of nature as a self-sufficing orderly universe, developed on impersonal lines, undisturbed by the arbitrary volitions of supernatural beings, seems likely. An Oriental brought up on traditions of personal government could not easily grasp that idea, could not but conceive the material world as subject, like himself, to the will of an irresponsible master. And even the few self-governing Semitic communities remained subject in religion to priesthoods that preserved the tradition of a celestial autocrat intact. The Greeks, as we saw, had no such priesthood, and therefore their high intelligence was left free to work out a truly scientific philosophy of nature. In positive science, on the other hand, Greece was much behind the great Oriental theocracies. These had long promoted the study of arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, although more as adjuncts to magic and religion than from pure speculative curiosity. Such curiosity was, as we have seen, the characteristic note of philosophy, and it is a signal merit of the early Greek thinkers that they should have known how to carry away what was really valuable in Eastern learning, while discarding nearly the whole of the superstition in which it was embedded. 5. Thales. Among the 7 sages of Greece, Solon of Athens has remained through all ages the most celebrated for practical genius, and many who would be puzzled to tell when or where he lived have heard of him as an ideally wise man. To those, however, who are not studying the history of politics, but the history of thought, the most interesting of the whole band is not Solon, but Thales of Miletus, the founder of Greek and indeed of all European philosophy. It is no accident that this wonderful man should have been a Milesian. At the time when he flourished, that is to say, early in the 6th century BC, Miletus was the most prosperous of the Ionian cities in Asia Minor, and the Ionians stood intellectually at the head of the whole Hellenic race, the furthest removed from primitive barbarism, the least exposed to contagion from the contemporary barbarism that surrounded Hellas like a sea on every side. We know that religious scepticism began at a comparatively early date among the Ionian Greeks, for those parts of the Homeric poems where the gods are exhibited in a rather ridiculous light, although among the latest additions to the original epic, are still very ancient, and these are evidently the work of an Ionian hand. It only remained to substitute a serious scientific explanation of the world for the discredited Olympian mythology, and this was first attempted in the school of Miletus. Thales was not a writer of books, and what we know about him comes from reports of which the earliest cannot be dated nearer than half a century after his death, while the most important information of all comes from Aristotle, who lived not much less than 2½ centuries later than his time. But it all seems credible enough, and on putting these scattered notices together, we reach the conception of Thales as a true master of those who know, combining great practical sagacity with a firm grasp of scientific realities, so far as they were then accessible, and an instinctive feeling out after that universality which alone can lift positive science to the supreme heights of synthetic philosophy. He is credited with having discovered certain elementary propositions of geometry: that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are equal, and that if two straight lines intersect, the opposite angles are equal. Anyone can see by looking at the figures that the fact is so. Perhaps Thales first proved that it must be so. And he is also stated on good authority to have predicted an eclipse of the sun, which the calculations of modern astronomy show to have occurred in the year 585 B.C. Apparently Thales owed his place among the 7 sages to that lucky forecast. I say lucky, because at that time astronomers knew no more than that eclipses recur at certain intervals. They were unable to tell whether a particular eclipse would be visible on a certain part of the earth's surface or not. Thales no doubt ascertained, by studying the tables drawn up by Babylonian astrologers, that a solar eclipse would be visible somewhere or other that year. By good fortune, not only was it visible in Asia Minor, but it also fell on the day of a great battle between the Lydians and the Medes, so alarming the combatants that they separated and made peace. So much for Thales as a man of science. As a philosopher he taught that water is the principle of all things, or what we should call the fundamental element. It was a Semitic idea, quite familiar to us from the earlier chapters of Genesis, that the earth is surrounded by water on all sides, being protected against an inflooding of the great deep below by its own solid structure, and against eruptions from above by the solid vault of heaven, a notion whence our word firmament is derived. In like manner, modern science conceives the earth and all the heavenly bodies as surrounded by a vast sea of ether, the medium by whose pulsations light, heat, electricity, and perhaps even gravitation are constituted and transmitted. Now the idea has been gaining ground for some years past that matter is made out of ether, was originally evolved from ethereal particles or pulses, and is perhaps destined to resolve itself into them again. And it would seem that Thales came to the same conclusion about the derivation of all things from water, by a more summary process than modern science would approve of, but in a spirit closely akin to that of our own most advanced physical investigations, the generalizing, assimilating spirit so characteristic of philosophy in every age. Another recorded saying of the Milesian pioneer points in the same direction: all things are full of gods. Here at first sight we seem to have the old mythology back again, to be no further advanced than Hesiod was when he represented the great cosmic powers as personal beings, marrying, begetting children, and quarrelling with one another. If, however, we take the words in connection with the general drift of his teaching, they acquire another meaning. Had the citizens of a Greek republic been addressed as so many kings, they would none the less have represented a realm of law and order as against the personal despotisms of the East. And so, when Thales said that there was a god in amber, or a god in the lodestone, he really meant that the drifting cloud and the falling thunderbolt belonged to the same world of natural occurrences as the phenomena, then first beginning to be scientifically observed, of magnetism and electricity. End of section 2.